Hello and welcome to this session. This is Professor Farhat, in which we will discuss the second normal form and the database normalization. Now keep in mind this lecture is for CPA candidate, specifically studying for the Information Systems and Controls exam. I'm going to go ahead and start discussing the second normal form. However, you have to understand that the second normal form, the prerequisite for this is the first normal form. In other words, if you don't understand what the first normal form is, please go back and view the prior recording, because to be in a second normal form, you're going to see one of the condition is being in the first normal form. Therefore, I'm going to assume that you viewed the first normal form. Let's go ahead and get started. Before we proceed any further, I have a public announcement about my company, farhatlectures.com.
Farhat Accounting Lectures is a supplemental educational tool that's going to help you with your CPA exam preparation as well as your accounting courses. My CPA material is aligned with your CPA review course such as Becker, Roger, Wiley, Gleam, Miles. My accounting courses are aligned with your accounting courses, broken down by chapter and topics. My resources consist of lectures, multiple choice questions, true-false questions, as well as exercises. Go ahead, start your free trial today.
What are the conditions to be in a second normal form? Well, the first condition I already mentioned a second ago. The table must be already in a first normal form, 1NF. It means each table cell should contain only a single value, atomic. This is a review. Each records need to be unique. This means the table have no repeating groups or arrays. When we already covered 1NF, but that's a condition to be in 2NF. The second condition to be in 2NF is to eliminate something called partial dependencies. Now we need to understand what a partial dependency. A partial dependency occurs when an attribute is dependent only on part of the composite primary key rather than the whole key. So what does that mean? Best to illustrate this in an example, but simply put, when you have a composite key is when you have two columns, for example, the name and ID of the employee, basically, and those are the primary keys, and those are composite primary keys, and you might have other attributes. A partial dependency occurs when an attribute is dependent only. So let's assume one attribute is here, just the email, just for the sake of illustration. Email, when it's dependent only on a part of the composite primary key rather than the whole one. So therefore, the email is associated only with an ID, or the email is associated only with the name. Well, then we have a partial dependency. Don't worry, we're going to work a complete example, but I'm just trying to explain what a composite primary key. It means there are two attributes to form the primary key, more than one. So to be in 2NF form, every non-key attribute, means the keys that are not part of the primary key, non-key attribute, must be fully functionally dependent on the entire primary key. It cannot be dependent on one part of the primary key. And we said the primary key could be two attribute. Simply put, all data must depend on the primary key. And the primary key here is a composite primary key. So if it's a composite, it has to be dependent on both. In other words, each table must contain data about one single type of thing. Whatever that thing is, it has a primary key. And this table is dependent upon that primary key, whether it's a composite primary key or a single primary key. It does not matter. All non-key attribute must be fully functionally dependent on the entire primary key. And let's take a look at what partial dependency. Partial dependency is a concept in data normalization. Partial in contrast to what? Partial in contrast to full dependency. So here we cannot have a partial dependency. So partial dependency is that concept in database normalization that's relevant when you want to move from 1NF, first normal form, to the second normal form. It occurs when an attribute in a table is dependent only on a part of the composite primary key rather than the entire primary key. And to be in second NF, every non-key attribute has to be dependent upon the entire primary key. Don't worry, we'll work an example starting now. So let's take a look at an example. Let's take a look at this database that's used by a university to track courses students are enrolled in, where each record includes a student ID, course ID, student name, and the course name. And it looks something like this. Student ID, course ID, student name, and course name. Now this table is 1 in 1NF, so it meets the first condition. Now what we're going to do is this. The combination of student ID, and course ID forms a composite primary key, as each student can be enrolled in multiple courses and each course can have a multiple student. So if we want to know a particular students in which courses they are enrolled in, the primary key is the composite key, which is the two, the student ID and the course ID. Now, do we have a partial dependency here? Well, let's see if we have a partial dependency. Well, student name is dependent only on student ID. So if I want to know the student name, each student will have a student ID. Once you know the student ID, you can know the student's name regardless of the course that they are enrolled in. Because once I know 002, I know the student name is Bob. That's fine. The course name is dependent on the course ID. Once you know the course ID, for example, C102, that's chemistry. You know the course name irrespective of which students is enrolled in. Well, now here what we have is these dependencies are called partial because the attribute student name, course name depend only on part of the composite and not the entire key. So if I want to know the student name, I don't have to use course ID and course name. All what I need is one part, student name. To know the student name, I need to know their ID. Therefore, course ID will not appear because all what I'm looking is for the student name. So this is what we called partial because the attribute depend only on a part of the composite primary key, not the entire key. Now, what's the problem with this? What's the problem with this table? Kind of we discussed it a little bit in the prior session. The same student name and course are repeated across multiple records. So notice here we have Elise's name is repeated across multiple records, leading to unnecessary data duplication. That's one. Two, if student's name change, like a name, legal name change, it must be updated in multiple row, which could increase the risk of error. So if we want to update Elise's name, then we have to update, first or last name. Then we have to update this in many different places. And if a new course is added and has no students in it, so if we want to add a new course, let's assume, accounting, and there are no students in accounting, then we have to put dummy data because there's no student in accounting because this course name is part of this field and they're all part of the primary key. So if we don't have a primary key, we have to put dummy student ID and dummy course ID. So I hope you see where the problem is. So if students has not enrolled, it becomes problematic to add this record without creating null entries, and we don't like null entries or dummy keys. So to resolve this issue and go to 2NF, what we have to do is we have to determine where's the partial dependency, and every time we have a partial dependency, take it out, create a new table. In other words, every table should be about one thing and one thing only, one primary key. So what does that mean? So I would say student ID and student name, they should be one table. Now if we have a student name, address, email, phone number, they should also be part of the student ID. So this is what we have to do. What we're going to have to do is to break those tables. And course ID should also be a different table. Course ID CO101, biology, CO102, chemistry, CO101, biology. Now we could have more information about the course ID, who's the teacher, the location, the building, so on and so forth. We can also do that. We're trying to keep it simple, but the point is here what's happening is we have data that should be in two separate tables. Why? Because we have what we call the partial dependency. So what do we do is this. Here's what's going to happen. We're going to create a student ID. And in the student ID, we only have information about that student. It could be student name, date of birth, their email, just only information about that student ID. Then for the courses, same thing. The course ID, name of the course, if there's any information about the course, if it's 3 credits, number of credits, like 3 credits, 4 credits, 2 credits, so on and so forth. How many credit is that course? Or any other information we want to add about this course without creating any partial dependency. So this course ID will be only about the courses. What we do next, then, we create an enrollment table and links students with course ID using the foreign keys. So the foreign key here is 001, which is the student ID, and the course ID from this table is the course ID C101, C102, C103. And what we did now is we removed the partial dependency from the table. We removed the partial dependency from the table. And this is how you go from 1NF to 2NF. So after normalization, here's what's going to happen. Each table includes data that's fully dependent on the primary key. So again, in each table, the student ID, course ID table, each table does what? Each table is fully dependent on its primary key. So that table is about courses. That table is about the student. Redundancy and update anomalies are significantly reduced, and each piece of information is stored only once, ensuring consistency and reducing the chance of errors. So this structure reflects a database organized according to 2NF, where there are no partial dependencies, and each non-key attribute must be dependent on the whole primary key. And this is what I told you at the beginning. Non-key attribute in that table has to be dependent on one primary key. Let's take a look at this multiple choice question from farhatlectures.com. A financial services company maintains a database for client transaction. The table records include transaction ID, client address, transaction amount. The client address is only dependent on client ID. To normalize this table to 2NF, what action is necessary? So we have this table, and one of the attribute, the client address, is only dependent on the client ID. So what do we have to do? There's a partial dependency. This is what they're saying here. I'm giving you this question in form of a partial dependency. What do you need to do with this? Well, remove the client address from the table and link it to the client ID in a new table. Would we do that? And the answer is yes, that's what we will do. We will take out the client address, and we have the client address should be where? The client address should be with, actually, it will be a new table, but that new table, think about it, it should be like a customer table. Customer ID. Under the customer ID, what's going to happen is you're going to have the client address, phone number. It's a separate table. Separate table, then the transaction ID. The transaction ID is separate. So you can look up a customer without looking up their transactions. But if you want to look up both, it will be customer ID and transaction together. So will turn it into a 2F. Create a composite key of client ID and client address. Well, creating a composite key does not address the dependency issue, and if anything, it reinforces it. We don't want this. We just want to create a new table with client addresses. Again, we'll have more information in that table, but since this is the limited information that we are giving, B is out. Place transaction amount in a separate table. No, the transaction amount should be part of the transaction ID, should be part of the client ID. We're not told anything that the transaction amount, and think about it. If you have a transaction related to a client ID, we want to know the transaction amount. So the transaction amount does not have a partial dependency issue. It's fully functionally dependent on the transaction ID because it's related to the transaction ID. So C is out. Link transaction ID with client ID in a new table. It does not address the partial dependency problem. It just simply rearranges existing relationship without normalization benefit. So you don't link the transaction ID with client ID in a new table. That's not what we are looking at. What's going to happen is you're gonna go back and say, okay, we have a transaction ID and client ID, and the address is dependent on the client ID, which is you did not solve the problem. So remove the client ID from the table and link it with the client ID in a new table. What should you do now? You want to go to Farhat Lectures, look at additional MCQs. That's going to help you, especially if you're studying for information system and controls exam. Invest in yourself. Good luck. Study hard, and of course, stay safe.